Chapter 6 Memories. During the fight between the king and the guardian, the three men had been talking. Dabriana, Ragnar, as well as Leon had come up with a plan. The plan that the men had come up with was simple: play to the vices of Remy. While Leon's safety was a top priority for them, they couldn't just ignore the others in the cages. This was especially true after learning of the conditions that the prisoners had to go through.
Who is this intriguing gentleman? And furthermore, why is my precious Leon unchained?
Remy said. The final bit of that sentence was reinforced with the utmost malice. I'm just old friend of Clavin, Dabriana said, while motioning in the Frozen King's direction. As to why Leon is free, well, that's because he's part of humanity, and that makes him part of my responsibility to look after. You could tell that this particularly annoyed Remy quite a bit, though he was able to keep his calm, eccentric persona.
I see. So he's your responsibility, you say? You didn't truly answer the first part of my question, so I'll ask once more. Just who are you?
I am no one. Not any longer, anyway. I used to be a knight. I used to be a tutor. Now I'm simply someone trying to survive and pave the path for others to live in this dystopian world we've come to call home. While I know this may not be the answer you were looking for, it is the most honest answer I can give. Well, that, and I am currently one of the 4 generals of the Resistance. Although, from this situation, I'm sure you suspected something of the sort.
That is something I am deeply excited to hear, although I'm not sure why you'd be so forthcoming with that information. Do you understand the situation that you're in?
Remy stretched his arms out wide in a grandiose fashion and looked around as if to say this area was his and his alone, indicating to the foolish man in front of him that he had a multitude of godly guardians at his beck and call. Slowly, he raised one hand from his sides high up in the air. At the same time, the other fell to his side. Following this, Remy clenched his raised fist, and this time, even Leon felt something. Leon became groggy in his movements and even in his breaths. It was as if the time around him was slowed, or at least his own time. This feeling led Leon to lean on the nearby shack, feeling too ill to maintain his balance.
Go on now, get him,
Remy said excitedly while nodding to a couple of nearby godly guardians.
And don't you dare harm my poor little Leon.
The 2 obeyed and did a similar transformation as the guardian the king had fought had done. One was slightly taller than the 8.5-foot behemoth that Clavin had just taken down previously. The taller one summoned a black crystallized longsword from the nothingness. The other drew what could only be described as 2 looking shields fused with swords. This created the effect of holding a shield, but also having a blade at one end so that it could be used for both attack and defense. Dabriana clumsily stepped away from Leon, while the 2 of them charged simultaneously at the seemingly off-balance general. They both reached him at nearly the same time, but for some reason hesitated to attack. Do you know what can pierce armor without the need to break it? Dabriana asked, rather calmly. Just as soon as he said that, however, both guardians simultaneously shrieked in agony, stumbling around him. Let me answer that for you, as you seem to be incapable of doing so. Eat, Dabriana said, smiling. Do you know what happens when temperature is so high that the armor you have begins to boil? Inwardly, the insides begin to slowly swelter as well. Not instantly, mind you, but over time. Now, what do you imagine happens when that armor is a part of you? The guardians continued to whine in agony, screeching, clawing at themselves. It was almost as if they were trying to tear their own souls away from their bodies. You'll burn, Dabriana said, just as he drew his sword from his back, which had been well hidden under his cloak. It was a grand-looking long sword, and as soon as it was pulled out, it became lit in a blue flame. With it, he sliced through the both of them with no more effort put into it than someone using a diamond blade to cut bread. The Guardian's insides sizzled only shortly before blowing up in a violent explosion. Is this due to their biological makeup? Leon didn't know, but it seemed to him that they had to at least in part be made up of raw energy from what he had seen from the insides of their mouth. He went from leaning to crouching and finally just sitting against the wall. He had an uneasy feeling about things, and not just how he felt physically, but because he was only able to watch and listen to what was happening. That alone didn't sit well with him at all. You didn't really think that would work on me, did you? Dabriana asked, looking at Remy, who now seemed almost dumbfounded. No, maybe I did give a groggy appearance, but I mean, can you blame me? I did have to move to not get your, how you put it, precious Leon in an unfortunate blaze.
Why, that is true. My, I suppose it's best not to underestimate you, my dear sir. No, it's not like I thought that would work. If you were telling the truth, that is. I did have to assess that, though. As you see, I needed to make sure it wasn't one of those little lies you humans tell so frivolously.
Do you want to hear a story? Dabriana asked, as the cooled lava pits began to sizzle and boil once more. Some of the lava was now bouncing out over the sides. Remy replied by doing a slight bow with the hand he had clenched facing his chest. The other hand reached out, palm facing upwards, towards Dabriana, as if to say he would be delighted, and the floor was his. Do you know why this place is a volcano covered in snow of all things? Before your father took over and ended the war, when it was just your siblings fighting our gods, this was my kingdom to watch over, my land. Clavin, the current king, was a fresh individual whom I had come to look over. He may have made this his kingdom, but it is still my land.
Just a little longer,
Ragnar thought. While all this was taking place, he was slowly breaking through the cages and releasing the prisoners. That is, those that still had the will to leave and fight. Some were utterly beyond help, and while they weren't interfering with the escape of the others, they could be seen as already gone. He could tell Dabriana was getting ready as well. The temperature kept rising, and the lava along with it. Dabriana continued. When I knew Clavin, he wasn't anything like the man I see before me now. He wasn't perfect, and that's understandable knowing the circumstances that he faced that had brought him here. He did used to have a sense of justice, though. Tell me, Clavin, did losing Razor really twist you this much? For some reason, the Frozen King couldn't understand what Dabriana was talking about. It had been a long time since anyone had spoken that name to him, the name of his wife, who had died during the height of the war. Have you really been feeding the people here corpses of your fellow men? This was something that was unspoken to the majority of the people here. For it wasn't just the slaves and captives that had been eating other humans. It was nearly the entire so-called kingdom. While once it may have been great, it was now really nothing more than a deserted outpost, at least in Dabriana's eyes. Remy sensed drama and did what he could to fuel it. All of this drama, of course, pleased him. It was a very dramatic sight for someone to see that was on the outside, someone who had no ties with the people or had no worries. He released his grip over the people just enough to where they were able to talk. The ones by the Guardians had already begun chattering as the others joined in. Some cried, others gagged, sickened by that which had been sustaining them for the past many years. Some had an idea, of course, what had been happening, but it's not something you would bring up. There weren't many animals around here, and hunting was limited by the decree of royals. They were the humans favored by the dark gods and given their blessing. Some royals even like human meat themselves, but having a supply of different varieties of beings would give them a more luxurious life. On top of that, this kept the unfavored humans in line. Leon couldn't help but think back to history class. It was nearly identical to the tactic used by the US government in the 19th century to keep the Native Americans in check. On top of that, without a stable food source by attacking the bison population, this would then allow them to manipulate and control the native people in many different ways. They were allowed to live, but were clearly at the mercy of those around them, which food shortages served well to keep them weak and prevented further rebellions. This time, it was most of humanity, minus a select few, that were being manipulated and kept weak. You may not die from old age, but you would eventually fall and fade away if you didn't eat, only to be reborn and live through this helpless process again, much like some of the prisoners here who were on the verge of doing so. The king was, of course, given a small stipend of food for the kingdom, but it clearly wasn't enough to sustain them. Finally, Claven began to speak.
Dabriana, I failed. You were right. We should have gone with you. I've tried everything and failed time and time again. I betrayed my own, slaughtered countless, turned over many others. You know, though, it wasn't only I who failed. You failed us just as much.
I failed? Dabriana asked, sincerely.
This may cause problems going into the future for the kingdom, but I need you to know the truth. Shortly after you left and the kingdom became subjugated, I knew at the time what it would mean for us. I knew just how much we would have to sink. I sent out scouts trying to locate someone in the resistance. This was in vain. The war had just ended. There were no signs of the resistance anywhere, and for good reason. I know it was not stable yet, and if it had been found out at that point, I'm sure nothing good could come of it. Yet, still, I searched, until one day I didn't, and then...
The king lost his words and clenched at his forehead, showing his lamba 5. It was as if he was trying to remember something, but couldn't. You fool, Dabriana said gently, with a saddened expression. Enough time had passed which allowed for Ragnar to get the others out of the cages without notice. This was due to the significant discussion occurring between Dabriana, Claven, and all the people in the kingdom talking. The buildings played their part as well by obstructing everyone's view to a degree. A snake passed by Dabriana, and he knew it was time. The guardians were close to the citizens, but were not holding on to them since earlier when Remy had told them he may change his mind at sparing them should any try to escape. I understand, Claven, Dabriana said. For your son's sake, and your people's sake, I will free you. With that, the magnum from deep below the crust of the kingdom rose up in multiple spots. It caught a few of the Guardians off guard and began to melt the outer exteriors of those that weren't prepared or quick enough to dodge. At the same time, the open lava pit that was near Clavin and Remy shot up. Dabriana controlled it with ease, sending a massive gush of magma towards Remy. This was just enough to force him to move and break his concentrated hold on those around him, allowing the people to move and retreat.
If you want to escape this hellhole, run towards the gates now,
Dabriana yelled with an explosive voice while rushing towards Remy, his sword arched, ready to strike him down. The citizens, guards, and about every human there ran as fast as they could towards the gate. Dane, on the other hand, started heading towards the king, and Vance followed suit.
I need to release him, Vance. I need to release our king.
Vance had no idea what Dane was speaking of, only to assume he meant rescue him.
I got it. Let's go get him and fast,
Vance said. Some of the Guardians that weren't liquidated quickly headed in their direction. Vance pulled out some impervious metal knuckles as one of the lower-ranked Guardians rushed him. He was able to keep it at bay while Dane tended to the king. Seconds later, about 5 other Guardians were about to swarm them.
I guess we die together. None of us will die today,
Dane replied. With that, he placed his hand upon the king and said a few words.
John, Kevin, Yang, White, Demon, Riza.
Something sparked from within the king, and the memories that had been suppressed flooded his mind. A single tear started to run down the king's face until it froze over. The block that had been placed upon the king had been removed. He was now thinking more clearly and like himself than he had in a long time. The king's atmosphere changed. Around his body, it was so cold that Vance and Dane instantly felt a rush of cool air radiate from within the lava-induced heated kingdom. His hair had become speckled white, just as 5 Guardians had reached them. At that moment, the king swiftly took his sword and struck one of the Guardians' heads, causing it to be shattered in an instant. Everything that had been connected to it was frozen stiff. The other 4 Guardians were put on edge and slightly hesitated after what they had witnessed. One tried to throw a spear at the king, but it only turned into an icy powder as he blocked it with the sword. Without hesitation, the king gave his sword to Dane.
I don't need this,
he said confidently. The king approached the Guardians with nothing but his bare hands. He ended 2 of the weaker ones almost immediately, turning them into nothing more than ice sculptures before they shattered.
That is
all the king said. Another one approached quickly with what seemed to be a ferocious speed and strength. The king blocked it, and with a simple push from one hand sent the Guardian flying back. It knew it stood no chance, and took this moment to retreat. After it began running towards a different target, it collapsed to its knees and began cracking, just as the one he had fought earlier in his duel had done. This one, however, violently exploded in a purple cloud seconds after it collapsed. The final one approached the king.
You are nothing,
it hissed. The king created 2 icy daggers as the Guardian jolted towards him, slamming into him. The king only smiled.
You are stronger than your fellows, and for that, I showed you mercy.
The king dropped his icicle-like daggers, now covering a black purplish fluid from the Guardian's insides. The Guardian didn't know what happened as it stood there for a moment before finally collapsing with a loud thud. It was dead before it touched the ground. The king's forearm showed once more, and Vance was confused by what he saw. It wasn't a Lambda 5 that was showing, it was a Delta 5.
You see, Vance, our king hasn't been a Lambda 5 for a long time. Our king is nothing less than a Delta.
Now, the white demon's sleep was over, and had awoken once more from within the frozen king. Part 2. Explosions and a plethora of screams shook the kingdom at its core, while the heat of battle echoed through the inner kingdom walls. Dabriana launched a powerful blast that sounded like a rocket exploding towards Remy as more guardians charged the frozen king. During the commotion, Leon had moved towards the castle. He knew he could be more helpful than just running away or playing the role of bait. He was told while planning with Ragnar and Dabriana not to be reckless. Still, he had seen enough and felt that he couldn't just sit by any longer, remaining feckless with everything going on. He ran past a few guardians along the way to the castle, ducking and dodging, hiding behind anything available to him. The dust of the battle filled the air like a smoky fog, and the smell of blood had started to mix in. Leon took advantage of this and utilized the dust, debris, and inner structures, allowing him to get past nearly all the enemies undetected. Be aware of your surroundings, utilize them when you need to. He subconsciously executed what he was taught by his grandfather at a young age. It worked out for him, and he almost made it to the castle undetected until one guardian took notice of him. The guardian rushed towards him with an enormous blade, now just a few feet away. It had him. Right before it reached him, a guard was able to intervene at the last second, holding it off.
Go! Get out of here!
She told him. Not everyone had been as fortunate as he was, and a lot had already been slaughtered mercilessly by the guardians. I have to at least save the kid, he thought to himself, still rushing towards the castle, even after being saved. If the king's son's crib was any indication, he had a basic idea where the child would be. If I don't, then who will? He knew everyone was busy. The king couldn't get his son with so many guardians rushing towards him, and Ragnar was doing his best to try and protect everyone he could. If I were the nurse, I would likely have taken him back to the king's room to be in a familiar setting to keep him as calm as possible while everything was taking place. I hope that's the case, or I may not find him in time. While Leon had been a bit dazed on his way back to the prison cell, he wasn't so out of it as not to notice where he was headed. The main problem he faced was getting the kid to safety. Leon finally reached the castle relatively unscathed and entered. Once inside, he passed through the inner hall, reaching the hallway that led towards the king's chamber. But as he got closer, what he heard was something he rather wished he hadn't. With each step closer to the room, the sound became more profound. Crunching, chewing, and even some slurping was heard.
You'll pay for this? Don't be so dramatic.
A voice that sounded similar to that of the guardian the king had fought replied.
He chose his fate by trying to get in the way of me and that field over there. After I'm done with this man, I shall enjoy that child as well. Would you perhaps like to join them?
The guardian asked, while they continued chomping through the skin and bones of some unfortunate soul. Leon finally made it to the door and peeked around the corner. What he saw was as bad, if not worse, than what he had heard. The guardian was slowly eating one of the castle guards, while a couple of others lay dead nearby. Their heads were torn from their bodies, and blood splattered across the nearby crib, which was only about 10 feet away. The nurse and king's child sat near it helplessly, watching what was happening in front of them. The situation couldn't look any worse. That was until Leon noticed the cruelest aspect of it all. The guard that the guardian was eating was still alive. It looked as though the guard was in some sort of paralysis and still felt everything that was happening to him. Leon could see the man's muscles twitch just slightly, his eyes moving back and forth as the guardian took another bite, ripping off what remained of the man's right arm. Blood splattered all across the guardian and the floor, causing the guardian to use its long tongue to clean its face. It was a grim situation, and it was likely that the face of this hideous creature consuming him would be the last thing the man would ever see. The guard, who was unable to move, noticed Leon and locked eyes with him. They told him one thing: kill me. He wanted Leon to end him from the suffering rather than to try and save him.
I think it's time we end this, don't you?
The guardian said, looking at the guard.
You know, it's rare that we guardians are given our own selection of meals that we consume. Usually, we are only allowed to eat what the gods deem necessary for us. The exception to this rule is during incursion like this, or during wartime. So you see, it's been quite a while since I've been allowed to consume a valiant being such as yourself. Your conquest rank is far beyond what I am usually given to eat. So for that, I thank you.
Leon looked around to try and figure out what he could do. Something, anything, he thought. What can I do? He knew that it would have to be something unconventional, as he stood no chance against the guardian in front of him. But before he came up with a plan, things took a turn for the worse. The guardian opened the man's mouth and his own mouth, causing a violent wave of energy to erupt. The intense wave streamed from the man's mouth and into the guardian's. The guard's muscles rapidly twitched until whatever had been paralyzing him was either made null or had run its course. He let out a terrible scream of agony, unable to cope with what was happening to him, until a moment later he laid there still. His body, or what remained of it anyway, disintegrated and turned into dust. The guardian stood up. Its demeanor had changed significantly as it began to shiver and turn to an almost charcoal black color.
Finally! The guardian exclaimed. Finally, after so long, I have ascended to this level.
The child continued to cry, while the nurse just sat there silently shaking from that which she had witnessed. I have to act fast, or there's no telling what this fucking thing will do next. He saw a bucket in the nearby kitchen and grabbed it. He threw it past him towards the main hall, where he had come from while hiding around the corner in the kitchen.
Who's there?
The guardian roared. It jolted towards the magnificent hall from where Leon had come earlier at tremendous speed. Leon caught a short glimpse of it while it dashed past the kitchen and down the hallway, and for some reason, it was smiling. Once it rounded the corner, Leon made a dash for it. He arrived in front of the nurse and the king's child just a moment later. Hurry! Move now! He directed her. Still startled, she grabbed the child and headed towards the door. Leon noticed a dagger hanging on the nearby wall in the king's chambers and grabbed it. You never know, he thought. The nurse made her way through the door, and Leon was directly behind her. They quickly hurried down the hallway in the opposite direction of the guardian and rounded a corner. They kept going until they had a vague sense of security, believing that they were safe, at least for now. The nurse was somehow able to quiet the young child with a pacifier. This kept him from screaming and crying while they moved deeper into the castle. Is there a way out from back here? Leon asked the nurse.
There is,
she said, still shaken up.
But it's towards the fighting outside.
It wasn't optimal, but Leon didn't see how it could be any worse than being trapped in what felt like the Minotaur's labyrinth alone with the nurse and the boy. Their best chance at survival was to escape the castle and head towards the king and the resistance fighters. They moved forward through a hallway towards the back end of the castle. It was much like the original hall Leon had traversed to get from the magnificent hall to the king's room. However, in this case, it was a bit wider and more of what you would expect of an exhibit hallway, which this seemed to be. There were different types of art and history here, with paintings, armor, and other peculiar artwork throughout it. One thing that caught Leon's attention was a faded picture of Dabriana, the king, and others gathered around a big table in the dining hall. There was also a more recent portrait here of the king with his child and a woman he hadn't seen anywhere else. The woman was beautiful, pale with freckles, and fiery red hair. Her green eyes were likened to that of a pine tree that you might see towards the end of the fall season. In the portrait, she wore a plain yet elegant turquoise dress and pearl earrings. What he noticed last was the pin that she had tied up in her hair. The symbol was similar to what Leon had seen on the guards earlier, but without the snow leopard.
"Who is this?"
Leon asked the nurse curiously, while she still continued to comfort the king's child that had just begun to fall asleep.
"That's the king's late wife, Riza,"
she said, much calmer now.
"Not really much is known about her, as nothing is ever really said or discussed among the people. The king hasn't even mentioned her once since I've been here."
Well, that's odd, Leon thought to himself. After that, he continued to look around the place curiously as they moved through the hall. It was much different from anywhere he had ever been before. After all, they didn't really have castles in the States, let alone Kansas. Beyond the many memories, objects, and secrets this place held, he noticed there was a small level of electricity here. It didn't seem like much, but at the very least, the castle had some lighting that wasn't candlelit. It was the only place he'd seen anything powered other than the floating camera speaker at the guard station in the cave. Once Leon rounded the next corner at the end of the hallway, that feeling of relief that he had was stripped away in an instant. What he was left with was the feeling of despair. For as soon as he turned the corner, he was met with the sinister presence of doom. Part 3.
"Hello, Leon,"
it said to him with an overall intelligently toned voice. Its warm, sticky breath felt as though it was radiating energy upon his upper body. Leon, spooked, jumped back quickly on the defensive. As he got a much better look at what the Guardian had become from consuming the guard, a wave of horror came over him. The creature's eyes had changed to look like a white dwarf. This was a stark contrast from the purplish color that Leon had seen in them previously. Overall, its skin looked much sleeker and lighter now, with a contorted-looking nose that protruded from only where thick skin was before. Its skin tone had changed into a dark charcoal color, and around its facial structure and muscles, pale gray shading was now present, giving it depth to its complexion. Near where eyebrows would be expected to be, crystallized horns took shape that were nearly 6 inches long each. While the Guardian had somehow managed to now look more sinister than the others, at the same time it seemed oddly more human. The Guardian hadn't seemed surprised at all that he was here.
"Has it been waiting for me? For us?"
Leon thought to himself, unsure just how he had heard nothing from this gigantic creature as it approached.
But how did it know we would be here?
This he did not know.
"Go! Get out of here!"
Leon told the nurse, who was only a few feet behind him. She didn't hesitate to move this time and carried the toddler while running the direction they had come. The hallway was long, but she was making great pace as Leon continued to stand there, blocking the way of the threat.
"It doesn't matter what you try to do. I will have that child. They can't escape from me, for I can see them always,"
the Guardian declared.
"You can't stop the inevitable outcome, you weak human."
Leon looked behind him, and the nurse had already gone a far distance down the hall and just reached the corner. Leon turned his attention back to the Guardian in front of him. Yet, it paid him no mind. It seemed as though the Guardian was still watching and tracking the two of them through the wall. "Is this how it found us?" he wondered.
"I cannot kill you due to my orders. I don't have to be very nice either,"
it said as it finally approached. This only served to annoy Leon. He had heard this already in essence from Enzo, who had threatened him in multiple ways while he was in the cage. "You don't frighten me," Leon said, knowing full well that wasn't entirely true. Even as he said that, his body was there gently shaking without him able to control it. The Guardian towering over him just laughed while eyeing him. Next, it diverted its attention yet again to the wall. Still, it tracked the nurse and the child. If Leon was going to try and do anything, it was now or never. He jumped up with the dagger in his right hand and swung his body to the left, hoping to slice at least most of its eyes in one stroke. The Guardian was fast, too fast. It took notice of him as soon as it heard his muscles shift. It was alerted to his intentions. As Leon had begun his jump, the Guardian ducked down. Leon had swung the dagger, missing it completely, and the Guardian in turn gave him a solid punch to the ribs. The force of the strike sent him flying through the air until he crashed into the nearby wall. He was now at the base of the portrait of the king and his family. He coughed as a little blood came up following it. The Guardian had broken 5 ribs in that single strike and punctured one of his lungs. It just looked down at him before finally snorting and starting after the nurse.
"Wait, you bastard!"
Leon yelled as he was wheezing lying there. The pain was immense. It took everything and more just to yell that. The Guardian ignored him and continued onward, pushing further, struggling, and pulling himself up by grabbing onto a nearby stone shelf. He regained his footing using the wall and shelf as support.
"I said wait, goddamn you!"
He yelled again, the pain bringing tears to his eyes. "If I don't stop it here, they won't get out of this," he thought. The Guardian just looked back at him before it started dashing towards the archway, towards the child and the nurse. In a moment's notice, the Guardian was at the archway, roughly 20 yards in front of Leon at the end of the hall. With no time to waste, he took the knife that was still in hand, and with all of his might threw it at the Guardian. The blade flew fast and true. Between the unbelievable speed of the blade and the speed and momentum of the Guardian's movement as it was rounding the corner, there was no way for it to avoid getting hit. The blade pierced through the armored hide of the Guardian's hand that it used to protect its face and became lodged inside of its palm. While the Guardian did succeed in stopping the blade, it wasn't without consequence. The wound around the blade sizzled. The purplish fluid within the Guardian's hand had begun to pop like a pestilence. The Guardian grunted in pain, turning its full attention to Leon.
"You dare attack me?"
the Guardian bellowed.
"You insolent little hydronic! We were given orders to take you alive, but now..."
The Guardian was furious. It grabbed the dagger and ripped it from its hand and dropped it. The fluid on the dagger had hardened into a dark, almost black substance. It looked as though it had been crystallized, or more precisely, it seemed to be fulgurated. This surprised Leon and the Guardian both, although Leon was even more so shocked. How did he pierce the being in front of him when the king was having so much trouble with a weaker Guardian? How did he throw it as fast as he did? Could he have tapped into his conquest? It didn't matter. He knew that he was all but finished, as he could hardly move and was feeling dreadful at best. While he may have actually succeeded in delaying the creature long enough to save the king's child, He had no path for escape or plan to get out of this for himself. So, in earnest, he did all that he could and just smiled. The Guardian approached Leon speaking in a completely different language and filled with rage. The whole situation had pissed it off to an extent it couldn't control.
Vocito maledevocal,
it growled. It grabbed a long, sleek-looking mace from the nothingness that was made of some sort of black diamond material and dragged it towards Leon across the floor. At this point, Leon couldn't bear to move or even stand any longer for that matter. He slumped against the nearby wall, slowly sliding down until he was just sitting there. He watched the Guardian as it approached, the blades of the mace cutting through the carpet and sparking on the stone floor like a grinder. When the Guardian had finally made it to him, it just looked down at him with hatred, relentless, unwavering hatred. Leon, in pain, was only able to maintain a smile as he closed his eyes, ready for the end. With his eyes now closed, he felt something crawl across him, or rather, slither. He opened his eyes only to find that the Guardian was still there looking down on him. The giant mace was in the air about to crush him, but the curious sight of a viper crawling across Leon led the Guardian to hesitate in killing him, if only for a moment. Showing no fear, the viper then bared its fangs at the Guardian and hissed. The Guardian just laughed.
Another useless and defiant hydronic creature ready to die,
it said while looking at both of them with disgust. It started to swing at the pair of them until it heard a strange whistling sound approach. Something whistled through the air, heading towards the direction of the Guardian, forcing it to jump back quickly. Right as it did, an axe flew by in front of it where it had been only a moment earlier. The axe had hit and lodged itself in a vast support beam, now in between the Guardian and Leon.
You did well, lad,
a familiar voice said.
You didn't listen as you should have, but you did well nonetheless.
Ragnar had come from the entry that the nurse had run through and began to approach the Guardian. The viper had already slithered off at this point and went to Ragnar, who bent to tickle the creature's throat with his index finger. Afterward, it continued on. Ragnar continued to approach them while the Guardian just watched, almost stunned at the chain of events taking place. Soon after, another familiar presence appeared around the corner. Only this time, it was less welcome.
Go and fix him up while I handle things here, and maybe I'll consider it penance for what you have done to the various others. Understood?
Ragnar was speaking to Krista, who had followed him around the corner. She had a much more solemn demeanor about her than Leon had seen previously.
Handle things here. You think a puny hydronic like you stands even the slightest chance of doing anything to me?
The Guardian didn't care about Leon for the time being. It put its attention towards the two in front of it.
I was wondering what souls came crawling into the castle here. I was about to come and kill you before claiming that child for myself when this dumb human intervened,
the Guardian said, pointing its mace at Leon.
Power makes the weak blind and the strong weak,
Ragnar said, casually while facing towards the Guardian.
You think because you have gained power, you have somehow become immune to defeat. You think that because relatively you are stronger than most of us, hydronics, before, that now you are invincible. You are but a child in the way you see the world. But that is all the way of the dark universe, after all.
The true universe, you insolent fool,
the Guardian said, scowling at Ragnar.
You should step away. I think he's about to blow his cap,
Ragnar said, whispering to Krista. She moved to the side of the wall towards where Leon was sitting and waited until Ragnar began to move forward before she slowly headed towards Leon.
True universe? That's an objective phrase that you and your gods have come up with. My universe still exists. We still exist. How is my universe false again? Ragnar challenged, thinking of the Guardian pushing it little by little while moving towards it. The Guardian just laughed.
What kind of universe has no gods?
True, our gods are mostly gone. How many are still out there is a question many of us wonder daily. Many have wondered about this curious question, and the answer is we truly do not know. But are they completely gone? They may be defeated, yet we live on. Do they not live on through us? Just as those who have fallen do as well. We strive every day to make their memories mean something. We live and die using the knowledge we have obtained through many different studies and hardships of others. There are those of us who ignore the teachings and wisdoms of others, that is true. But even the fools were given the free will to live and die as they see fit. Can you honestly say the same? You, a species, created for nothing more than a tool of war? The Guardian was speechless, as it had no response to what it was just told. The contemplation of its existence seemed to have bothered it immensely. Before, it would have given no thought to it, yet now that it had evolved in such a way, it had become able to process things more than just at face value, and it didn't know what to think. Was it just a tool with no will of its own? A pawn with no use other than to follow orders? While overthinking things and listening to Ragnar's talk, the Guardian had lost focus. Ragnar not only had been able to get close to the Guardian, but he grabbed his axe that was thrown earlier, and upon realization of what was happening, the Guardian swung its mace, fast and hard, at Ragnar. Swiftly, he dodged to the right of it and then retaliated by swinging the axe at the Guardian's head. He only just missed its temple by no more than an inch, and instead grazed its cheek. The two were going at it intensely, yet it seemed as though Ragnar had the upper hand in the battle and was enjoying the fight. With the Guardian distracted, Krista had made her way over to Leon, who wasn't looking so great. When she got next to him, he thought about grabbing a piece of rubble nearby to fend her off, but he couldn't really muster the strength. Once there, she started the IV drip from her vein to his. I thought you were going to gut me. That's what you told your father, wasn't it? She just stared at him coldly, yet vigilant of what was happening only a few yards away. My father? You think the Frozen King is my father? Why do you think I'm helping you now? Does it really make sense that he would just leave me to die, and yet throw everything else away for his son? The only reason he has been looking after me was that I think subconsciously I reminded him somewhat of his dead wife. Leon looked at the portrait above them and then back at her. He noticed that she did indeed have similarities to the girl in the picture. It wasn't an exact match or anything, but the hair was about the same length, though it was strawberry blonde instead of fiery red. She also had a more fierce color of green eyes than his wife did. But with the freckles that they both shared, he did see a slight similarity between the two. And you're right, I wanted to kill you for your conquest. In all honesty, I still could now, if I wanted to. However, getting accepted into the city of Salutis is more important. Now that you've solved the mystery, maybe you can see how this will offer me much more protection. Much more than what the Frozen King, along with your conquest, could ever hope to do. I never want to experience what I felt again today. The helplessness, the fear, the smell of that pungent stench encompassing my head. I made a deal with Ragnar to help. By doing so, I will be given protection, just like anyone else. Krista was obviously traumatized by what had happened to her, of what almost became of her earlier. The creature had her dead to rights, and no one would have lifted a finger to save her. She was still frightened by how she had almost been consumed head first by the original guardian the king had defeated only for the sake of his son. She was only ironically to be saved by the same child's cry who started this whole crazy mess that they were now all in. Had he never cried, she would have been dead and gone. Leon said nothing else, and just continued to rest and watch as she was healing him. Ragnar and the Guardian continued to fight one another. Blow after blow, it seemed as if they weren't even close to being on equal footing. The Guardian had not landed a single shot on Ragnar, yet the opposite was true.
Ragnar had landed multiple little cuts on the monstrous being, grazing it time and time again, slicing through its tough exterior. Finally, with one quick mighty blow, the Guardian slammed his mace into Ragnar, forcing him to block with his axe. Even so, he was thrown into a nearby wall, hitting his head. His head was bleeding a little now from the impact of the Guardian's last attack. Ragnar may have been quick, but the Guardian had an apparent advantage when it came to raw strength. It seemed that this could be the turning point for the Guardian, and it started to charge at Ragnar. But something was wrong. It seemed as though something insidious was at work. Ragnar smiled, watching the Guardian stumble.
What's the meaning of this?
The Guardian asked, while groggy in his movements. It's about time. You're pretty resilient, you know that? Ragnar said, while wiping the droplets of blood from his forehead. The Guardian continued to look at him while moving a bit unbalanced. You clearly aren't sure what's going on, so let me explain. You see, I'm quite experienced when it comes to venom. I died at the fangs of hundreds of venomous snakes only to be reborn in this hell world, which I originally thought to be Valhalla, or possibly even heaven. Neither of the two ended up being true. My full name, creature, is Ragnar Lothbrok. The man made it into legend by being dropped into a pit of snakes. So you see, my conquest has a lot to do with my death, and what's slowing you now is nothing more than a small taste of venom that my body was filled with before my final moments on Earth. Leon was starting to slowly feel better and had a small chuckle. Krista gave him an odd look, but he couldn't help himself. Leon had always enjoyed the Vikings television show that was put on the air by the History Channel, and remembered the scene where Ragnar was caged before being cast into a pit of snakes. The show was never the same without him, but before Ragnar had mentioned this, he didn't even think it would be that Ragnar. The Guardian and Ragnar continued to pay no attention to Leon even after his laugh.
I see,
the Guardian smiled.
Venom. If that's all this is, then I have nothing to worry about.
The Guardian stood there and inhaled, letting out a terrible, frightful sound as it did. The glow in its eyes grew brighter than Leon had seen from the creatures at any time previously. The light was so bright that he could not bear to look at its eyes. It was worse than that of a torch's arc. With that, the creature's demeanor changed, and then all of a sudden, it coughed up a green-purple, goopy-looking pus ball that was steaming. It was somewhat similar to what Leon witnessed earlier. However, this time, it was more rigid, like a warm tar, than that of a pudding.
I've acknowledged your strength, Ragnar, but you are nowhere close to being able to take me down. You are foolish to think that a small dose of venom from a puny serpent will end me.
I see. So it's true then. You've become a beta. It's been too many years since I've last seen one of you. Perhaps I was taking things too lightly.
The creature looked intrigued.
You must have been one of the survivors from the previous Great War, then. Yes?
That's correct. I was here during the Great Turmoil, and have been for a great many millenniums in this hell world. Unfortunately for you, that means I have a great deal of experience in dealing with your lot. While this poison from a puny serpent may not be enough, the great poison of a giant serpent has never failed to take one of you down.
With that, Ragnar charged into the creature with speeds more significant than anything he had shown to them before. His movements were like that of a charmed snake. He was swerving in and out, ducking and popping up and down. He was doing everything in his power to throw the Guardian off. With its eyes lit up, it swung a powerful blow, but this time it missed him by at least a foot. While charging in, Ragnar had already begun to swing his axe for what looked like an overhead strike. This was only meant to trick the creature, since it was merely expecting him to swing his axe and strike. Once the axe had gotten to its precipice, the Guardian jolted backwards. It thought that it was safe well outside of the strike zone. Unfortunately for it, Ragnar jumped and released the axe, making it fly. The axe flew with a powerful force that the creature could not dodge in time. It then slammed into the monster's stomach, lodging itself deep inside. The Guardian, while in pain, was about to try again to hit him back, but it was too late. Ragnar had already charged forward, jumping upon the creature.
making it impossible for it to properly swing at him. He landed upon the hilt of the axe, using it as a platform to look at the creature in its eyes. While looking at it face to face, he breathed upon it, or more accurately, spat a venomous mist upon it. The mist had gotten into its eyes, and the guardian dropped its mace before instinctively starting to rub his eyes. The creature, blinded, tried to grab Ragnar, but he had already retreated. The venom continued to spread and burn through its eyes and upon its face in a prolific manner. It seemed like this time it was a potent acidic venom from the noticeable burning that was coming from the creature's face and eyes.
You think this will stop me?
The creature shrieked at him from the pain it was experiencing.
I already told you, venom from your puny little serpents won't cut it.
The beast stood still, and while in pain, took a deep breath like before, and another hideous sound was released from the guardian. Ragnar didn't seem to be in a rush to stop it from what it was doing, and instead just sat there and watched, leaning against a pillar. Leon was feeling much better at this point and stood up. Krista removed the IV, and with a single drop of her blood, closed the hole in his vein.
What have you done?
Something was different this time, and the creature knew it. Unlike last time, there was nothing to purify itself from the venom launched upon its face by Ragnar.
Power makes the weak blind and the strong weak,
Ragnar said once more to the guardian.
In this case, I made you blind and weak. Unfortunately for you, this is not an ordinary venom. This is the venom of a great serpent that I slew to win the heart of one of my wives. It's so potent that even impervious metal will instantly degrade from coming in contact with it. Thus, I had to apply it directly to you.
I'll kill you! I'll kill you all and that child!
The guardian declared and charged him blindly, trying to pinpoint Ragnar's location by the sound of his voice alone and muscle movement. Ragnar was quickly able to avoid it and instead kicked the hilt of the axe to push the blade a little further into its stomach. The guardian moaned even more, letting out a fury of screams and curses at him. Ragnar remained calm and collected while looking at what he must have thought of as a pitiful creature. The creature continued to moan while flailing around erratically as the venom continued to burn and seep in deeper. Finally, Ragnar rushed the creature, pulling his axe from deep within its stomach. Purple fluid covered the part of the blade that had been plunged deep inside. The opening left from the axe was secreting the same liquid at an abnormally slow speed for such a deep wound. It seemed as though the creature was regenerating at the same time. This didn't matter. Once Ragnar had withdrawn his axe, he jumped at the guardian with an enormous force, spitting venom upon its neck mid-air as one would see from a spitting cobra. With the armored hide weakened by the toxin, he sliced through it with all his might, cutting and tearing its flesh away in the process. The creature was nearly decapitated. Its head was now connected to its nape by only a thin layer of hide. The guardian fell over in an instant. The slow pace of the liquid coming out from its stomach instantly sped up and became more profound. Even more liquid poured out from where its head was and what was left of its neck. The creature now mostly laid on its stomach, though angled a little from one of its arms propping it up. Its head was bent over its back like someone wearing a hoodie without utilizing the hood. The inside of the creature was both disgusting and interesting. It seemed as though the neurons could be seen throughout the creature's body, the different branches going throughout the body. Some of them were still glowing and pulsing, but slowly fading to nothing. Finally, they stopped altogether. "It's dead," Ragnar proclaimed as he tossed his axe to the side. It was no longer useful to him as it began to corrode and crack from the venom as soon as it came into contact with the creature's neck. Leon just stood there watching. The creature didn't move, didn't make any of its hideous sounds. It was indeed dead, and reluctantly, Leon had to admit that he was saved once more. Part 4.
Looking around what was once a quaint, quiet hallway in the back of the castle was now almost completely destroyed. The elegant foyer that existed to showcase past events and treasured memories was now a mostly demolished mess. Glass and debris filled the place along with the now dead guardian's body. A few things were left untouched, such as the portrait on the wall above. For the most part, however, things were either broken, shattered, or at least distorted in one way or another. Even the near pristine center carpet, minus a bit of dust, was now mostly ruined from the Guardian's mace. Ragnar began walking towards the exit of the hall. After a moment, he motioned to both Leon and Krista, who were both still looking at everything, to follow him. Together, they slowly made their way behind him without saying much of anything. Leon was still surprised and a bit impressed at how Ragnar had dealt with the Guardian with minimal effort.
I told you I didn't need your help,
Ragnar said randomly as if speaking to someone who wasn't there.
There wouldn't have been a thrill to it if I let you have your way.
Krista and Leon looked at each other confused, but individually they chose to ignore the sudden outburst. Ragnar picked up the dagger at the archway and looked at it, inspecting the hardened fluid on the upper half of it. With Leon right behind him now, he turned and handed it to him, handle first.
This is yours, I assume?
It wasn't technically Leon's dagger, but he thought that he had earned it by using it in the fashion that he did. He grabbed it from Ragnar, then beat it on a nearby wall to knock off some of the hardened fluid.
Thanks,
Leon said, almost begrudgingly. He was still a bit disappointed in himself, since he had once again been pretty much helpless. After taking possession of it, he cut a long piece out of the nearby silky carpet to wrap it in, before finally sliding it between his belt and cargo pants. After a moment, Ragnar pushed a button on what seemed to be a metal bracelet. The symbol on the bracelet looked like the sun, which Leon had not seen since he arrived here, and it began to flash at a slow pace from orange to black and back to orange again. Finally, the icon ceased its flashing, and seconds later, the sun transformed from a solid black engraving to a glowing bright orange.
This is Ragnar. What's the status outside?
He waited a moment, then a reply came in, crystal clear with no interference. The situation is contained. You're free to proceed and exit with the targets until. Again, you're clear to exit with the rescuees.
Got it. We'll be there in about 5. E plebis unum.
He spoke into the bracelet, and then pushed the button on the bracelet once more, and it turned back to its solid black color. Afterward, he began heading down the hallway that Leon had traveled with the nurse and the king's son. Both Leon and Krista followed close behind, and Leon finally decided it would be as good a time as any to get a few answers. What's with the tech? Everything else, for the most part, that he had seen seemed to him almost 20th century at best. But this was different. It was modern. Hell, he thought it could be even more advanced than anything he was used to. It was one thing to create an ore or metal weapon, whichever impervious rock actually was, but this was something else altogether. He'd never heard anything so clear before. Even cell phones had their limits. This made it sound like the person he was speaking with was right next to him. It would take a lot more than a forge and some small lab to create this. No, for this kind of tech, they would need advanced tools and facilities.
You'll see once we get to Salutis,
Ragnar replied. Shortly after, he noticed an unsatisfied look on Leon's face and decided to give him a bit more in-depth answer than that.
Just because things look grim here, and truthfully, they are in most places, that doesn't mean they are grim everywhere.
It still wasn't a great answer, but at least it gave him a little more insight into what he was to expect going forward. If this tech exists, then Leon had a thought.
If this was truly the afterlife, then that would mean all the greatest scientific minds that had once lived on Earth, Einstein, Newton, and others could potentially be here continuing their theories and improving upon the technology that had been on Earth. In that regard, wouldn't that mean that this Salutis isn't much different from our modern world to a certain extent? Leon asked with an intrigued excitement. I don't know much about science, lad. What I do know is you keep your knowledge and can improve yourself in many ways. I'm sure you remember most everything from your previous life, as do I. Combat, for example. There are many different fighting techniques that I had never even heard of before coming here. Many more were brought after I had been here for quite some time. There are trainers all over Salutis. Some are scientists that teach people and mentor others. It is a city where the greatest minds of humanity have survived. Some fight, some support. Everyone contributes and helps in one way or the next. Even if it is just sweeping the nearby street, people pitch in and help each other. It's humanity brought together for the purpose of survival. Everyone here had died at some point. The only exception to that rule is the Veals. This means that most don't want to experience death again, knowing that if one of those fucked up creatures consumes their soul, it could be permanent, or even if some human lays claim to it through conquest. That makes most here helpful, if only for the fact that they want to survive. Leon hesitated a moment, confused. You don't mean the king's child, do you? Ragnar looked at Leon's face and noticed the confusion from the Vil comment. He started to clear things up for him. That's who I'm referring to, lad. Don't misunderstand me, though. I know Vil means young calf on Earth. In a sense, the young part is right. However, Vil is an acronym here in this context. What it means is valuable energy among the living. You see, people cannot create a life after death. We are not gods. The exception to this rule is that a living female can create life from a dead man's seed. The witches' clan, who were once messengers of the gods on Earth, used to come here all the time. But for the most part, they have stopped coming to this place for obvious reasons. Therefore, Riza was the last known human to conceive a child here. Leon looked much more assured now, and things were starting to come together. At least more than they had been. Now, let me tell you why the life of a Vil is so important to the demons of the dark. Leon thought he must have meant the guardians and gods of the dark universe. You see, while our souls are food for them and enhance their own power, the soul of a living human is a much higher concentration of energy than that of a dead soul. The living soul has the ability and energy of life, as well as the energy that will be used for the transitioning into the afterlife, this hell world. Those more familiar with the stories from the gods have said that the living soul has the energy worth about 10,000 years in this hell world. While we don't age, a living soul and body do. But the time spent here is equal to 1/100th of the time on Earth. This means that for every 100 years a living soul spends here, it is only 1 year that their body and soul ages. So by this, you can at least get a vague idea of how much energy it must contain when in regards to our own souls that have lost their living shell, especially at a young age when it hasn't lost hardly energy at all. From that, the first breath, when the soul is formed within the body, it starts losing a bit of energy each day. Thus, the younger the person, the more energy it has to be consumed. At this time, they had reached the king's room, and Ragnar looked around the corner inside the room, and with a mild shout told the nurse with the king's child that it was safe to come out. You just left them here? I had to, lad. It was either leave them here or you die. We already told you that you were the priority in this case. They were safer here than if they would have run out into the conflict, or followed me back to where that bidden you were at. Leon didn't like his answer, but could understand the reasoning. He still didn't understand just why he was the priority in all this. Why was he the one they wanted to protect out of everyone here? Just why am I the priority? He asked Ragnar bluntly. You'll find more out in Salutis, my lad. Leon was unsatisfied with the answer, but he decided to let it go and figured he'd learn what he wanted to know eventually when things weren't so chaotic. They continued down the hallway, which Leon had thrown the bucket earlier to distract the now dead guardian. It was still there, lying untouched from when he initially threw it. Finally, they reached the magnificent hall.
While some places within the castle had seen considerable damage, this place looked the same as the first time he had seen it. The drapes still intact, and the chairs, where presumably the king would take requests, were still all in place, unbothered by the chaos. It was a fair bit warmer than when he first visited, but overall, things were as normal as they could be. While most everything in this room was pretty much the same, the door up ahead that led outside the castle now seemed different to him this time. Last time he went through it, he was leaving in manacles, and now he was leaving as someone who had both rescued and been rescued. Part 5. The castle door opened. What had once been a majority of dirt and ash was now a fiery molten graveyard. Burnt, contorted, and soulless bodies of both guardians and humans alike littered the inner castle grounds. There were both new and old faces around. The newer faces wore the same type of cloaks that both Ragnar and Dabriana were wearing. For the most part, these others were keeping watch, but a few of them were gathering the corpses of their fallen comrades. Afterward, they loaded them up into the nearby wagon. It seemed odd to Leon, who was watching the process from afar.
Those who still have their conquest intact will be reincarnated within the next hour to a couple of days. This is why they are checking each of their forums,
Ragnar said, after having deciphered Leon's look of confusion. A gust of wind came through shortly after, which removed much of the lingering smoke that had been obscuring their view. Immediately, both Leon and Krista had noticed one thing in particular that made much of this stunning and chaotic scene then seem almost insignificant. A massive creature towered over everything else ahead of them beside the now shattered gate. The beast had 4 claws upon each of its legs and arms, though talons would be the more appropriate term. This is due to how they curved in such a way that would allow it to grab someone or something unexpectedly. Each talon glistened from the light of the nearby flames. Though dark, each one gave a frighteningly intense reflection of the nearby scenery. Leon couldn't help but think that the last thing one might see before they died is their own terrified reflection in the creature's massive talons. Its body was enormous, and at least equivalent in size to that of a 2-story house. It had reasonably large wings that were embedded within its back, and its skin shimmered in the moonlight. With the moonlight shining upon it, there was a strong reminiscence to the color of an eclipse. The way it stood gave it a very preeminent stature, and behind it there were not 1, not 2, but 7 long, powerful tails that slashed around like whips. Each end seemed to be just as sharp as the dagger that Leon had tucked between his pants and belt. The most terrifying part of it was its heads. It had 3 of them, all terribly nefarious looking. Both eyes on each head were about the size of a human fist, and they looked like a mix between a cat and snake's eye. Its teeth were all large and jagged, which allowed them to fill every corner of its mouth, and the strangest thing about it was its breathing. It was odd enough that as it breathed, smoke would come from its mouth and nostrils. But the most peculiar thing about it was the different actions of each head. The one to Leon's left would do the inhaling, while the head on the far right would do the majority of exhaling. This made him wonder what the job of the head in the middle was. The great beast flapped its wings once and let out a frightful gust of wind. This served to feed the more massive flames, but at the same time it put out the smaller embers. It was like someone had just blown out the candles on a birthday cake made of death and destruction. After seeing this display, it was easy to see that its wings were even more enormous than they had initially looked. They had to at least be as long as the circumference of its body, if not a bit larger. Both Krista and Leon had no idea how to react, but seeing as Ragnar was calm, the beast must have not posed them any immediate threat. Not only that, but after closer inspection, next to it, Dabriana and Claven were both standing there, staring down at something under the beast's right arm. After a moment, Ragnar leaned over to the both of them and spoke softly.
Let us head that way. The beast you are seeing is the dragon known as Zimigarninich. He belongs to Dabriana. You have nothing to fear from it, that is, as long as you mind your manners around it. Although it is under Dabriana's control, it is still a prideful creature that has been known to lash out at those who offend it.
Neither of them said anything and moved towards the scene in front of them. The Frozen King, or Claven as it turned out was his name, was a bit injured, but overall was looking healthy. He noticed them first, and at the sight of his son, whispered something to Dabriana, who just nodded. Claven patted Dabriana's back and began to head over immediately.
Raven,
he said while moving towards them.
Is he okay? Is my son okay?
He was moving fast towards them while still holding his left shoulder with his right arm. They were about 30 yards away when Ragnar decided it would be best if they waited where they were for a moment. He directed them to do so, and they obeyed without question, still taking in the scene in front of them. Claven and Ragnar passed each other as one headed towards Dabriana and the other towards his only child.
He's fine, my king,
the nurse said.
Raven is fine.
The nurse moved forward towards Claven, trying to meet the injured man part way. The king brushed the small child's head with his hand and gave him a kiss when they met. The child, just yawning, smiled at the sight of his father. The Frozen King's whole persona seemed to be a lot different. One might have mistaken him for his twin brother had he had one. The man in front of Leon was not cruel, nor was he hateful at all. This was a loving father who was glad to see his child.
Where's Bradley?
Claven asked.
Sire, while your son and myself are unharmed, Bradley was consumed by one of those creatures. The only reason we're alive is due to the bravery of this young man here,
she said, directing the king's attention to Leon, who was just a few feet behind her. The king slowly approached Leon with a somber expression upon his face. Once he was in front of him, he just grabbed his hand and squeezed. There was a chill to them, but even so, they had a sense of warmth and caring that was unexpected.
Thank you, Leon. Thank you for putting yourself in danger for the sake of my son. I could not have asked you to do that, especially after how I had treated you earlier. I don't expect you any time to do so, but I do hope that one day you will forgive me, and if there's anything I can do for you in the future, please don't hesitate to ask. I owe you more than I could ever hope to repay.
It's all right, Leon said in return. I was just trying to do the right thing. While I don't understand or necessarily agree with everything you've done, I know that you had your reasons. The main being your son.
Ragnar, in the distance, motioned Leon over to where he and Dabriana were. Krista remained near the king, under his close observation, while Leon moved towards Ragnar. As he approached, he heard the distinct sound of that noticeably over-eccentric voice from earlier. Given the situation, the voice was surprisingly not any less idiocentric than it had been before when Leon had gone inside the castle. There was a crazy amount of laughter, which made it seem as though they were on the brink of insanity. That is, if they had any sanity to begin with.
Oh my, what more can I say? I can't believe it. I just can't believe it. I was defeated by a mere human. This is fantastic. Who would have thought that myself, a demigod, would have been beaten by a human? No, I was told, warned even, to be wary of you alphas. I can't. No, this is just exhilarating. The most surprising part, and to top it all off, is you have a fucking dragon. Oh my, this is Amazing! Fantastic! Just fantastic! This is the epic climax I was hoping for! You humans are astounding! To think that the king could fake his own conquest level like that by manipulating his own memories, suppressing his training, among other precious memories to turn him into the frozen king, which allowed him to succumb to such ruthless behavior towards his fellow man. How could he have lived with himself in that situation if he had remembered everything about his wife and all the memories they shared, while at the same time throwing away others like they were nothing? My, I suppose it's the only thing he could have done in that circumstance, for both his sanity and for the fact that he would have been under much stricter observation, since most that are above are consumed immediately. I wonder what he's thinking now. He must feel pretty awful. Though, I do wonder what is going to happen to him when he gets to your base. All those deaths he was a cause of and the souls he helped condemn. What will all the people say about it? You're his friend, so maybe you can see past it. But do you really think it will be the same once you get him to your little cave? Or whatever it is you rebels live in? My, what a will to live, all to protect his son, to do such horrible things, and to throw away those precious memories and his humanity. What a thrill!
As soon as Leon had made it there, Remy had taken notice immediately, and with his mutilated face, smiled upon him. What Leon saw of Remy was now far different from the being who had seemed to have had everything in his clutches not long ago. Now he just looked like a beaten and dying dog, rather than any sort of god. His hands were cut off, and the dragon had him pinned to the ground in a small pit of fire while clenching his body tightly. Its talons from one of its great hands had pierced Remy at multiple angles. His flesh was burning faster than he seemed to be regenerating, and most of his clothes had already been burnt off entirely. What hadn't been burnt off was already so far in the process of it that it may as well been. His blood was a thick mixture of both silver core and human blood, and was steadily dripping from the large punctures from where the talons had pierced.
Well, if it isn't my precious Leon, have you come to see me off? I'm sorry we didn't get to have our precious dinner date. It seems plans have changed.
A couple of his teeth were missing, many others were shattered. Those that were still partially intact were smiling at Leon while covered in a slaver of slime and ichor.
Do not speak to the boy,
a loud voice echoed from above. A long neck extended down to the tiny demigod Remy and growled fire.
Another word to him and I'll end you now. Focus on answering my master's questions, or I'll burn you more.
It was Zimigurninich, the dragon. Its middle head spoke to Remy at a heated distance of only a meter, demanding subservience.
Burn me more, you say? I don't think you can burn me much more, dragon. I'm already burning in this fire pit you created yourself.
You could tell this pissed off Zimmy. Its first head, which did the inhaling, took a long, deep breath. It was surely meant to bring out enough fire to burn a whole village. But right before he let him have it, Dabriana stopped him. That's enough, Zimmy. The creature exhaled smoke out of its third head like a power plant chimney, blowing it all in Remy's face. This proved only to obscure the ragged demigod's vision, and instead of blasting him with a devastating hellfire, just made him choke. So tell me, Remy, how did you come to seek Leon? Why did you come along on, as it was described to Claven, a simple pick-up and delivery run? Dabriana asked with an intense glare.
Why, you ask? You think Leon was sought after for some special purpose? Is that it? While he is just adorable, my alpha friend, you have it all wrong. This is how all of our high-level conquest pickups work. We have a system in place to make sure that those high-level conquest users, when reported, are taken out immediately. This is so that they don't one day become a problem like yourself. I mean, sure, for the normal quotas that we make each individual subjugated colony collect for us each month, we only send a lower ranked worker. Sometimes a few are needed. That, of course, is dependent on the quota that the colony has for those pickups. These workers are a dime a dozen, just as the souls that they collect. They are useful, but not irreplaceable. Useful for sustenance, energy intake, and pleasure. But a lowly conquest rank soul can be found nearly anywhere at any time. We make each kingdom give us what we think is fair. For instance, this tiny little castle and village we make contribute 50 human souls each month. That may seem like a lot, but in reality it's not. While there are many kingdoms and they compete for the same souls, we found that on average there are about 1,500 new souls each day. That means as long as the colony, kingdom, or whatever that little despot of humans that works for us likes to be called makes its quota, we allow them to use the overstock for whatever they want. Be it trading for money, their sick and twisted games, or perhaps even perverted pleasures that they make these new souls provide for them. It matters not to us. You humans seem to have learned envy, lust, greed, and gluttony all on your own. Perhaps due to your god's lack of guidance, they wiped their hands of you many times over, and in turn created your wrath and self-pride. They left you there to die, to fight among yourselves for no other reason than to create warriors, only for you to die and then fight here. This has led some of you to hate your gods. Even after learning of what has happened and of our attack on your universe, some of you still abandon them. Those who chose this come to us of your own volition, so that they continue to be who they were born to be, savages. I can't blame them. I don't think you should either, as it's only natural to continue being who they were on Earth and live with the same leisure that they had become used to. And why not? Your gods have all but lost, so why should they continue to fight their war when they can follow us? The teachings may be a bit different, but the concept is the same. Humans were always made to follow. Why should that have to change just because the rules and the gods did? You weren't all nice and friendly on Earth, so why try and pretend to be here? I've heard the stories of giant metal birds with no one in them shooting down families at weddings and school buses on orders from your leaders. So why should things change now? For what reason? Do you blame us for both the failures of your gods and your own failures? I guess it matters not.
They all just looked at Remy while he continued to smile and cough. His time was running out, and he was just about on his last wind.
So you see that I've told you the essence of my story. I'm curious to know why two alphas, generals for that matter, were after Leon in the first place.
He looked at Ragnar and somehow knew what Leon did not. He was also one of the generals of the human resistance. "It's none of your business, cretin," Ragnar replied. Remy looked at him with a questionable disposition.
Cretin? I must take minor offense to that. While I may be a bit deformed now, I'm far from unintelligent or unaware of how you humans think. I suppose that you're not going to answer me, though, are you?
"I suppose not."
That's fine. Just might I add a tiny little thing? While you lot are strong, keep in mind I am probably the weakest of my family. A dark demigod born from a human witch is, while an interesting combination, it's not at all who you have to worry about in terms of combat. In fact, I'll tell you what many do not know. I'm not just the weakest demigod of the true universe. I am the only demigod from the true universe. I am the youngest of my siblings, who are far beyond my inconsequential lifespan of a couple hundred years. My siblings, though created directly by my father, are still full-fledged gods. They of course also had a closer relationship with him as they lived beside him and were given great responsibility here. It was they who for countless centuries laid waste to your gods before he came to end it himself. Even the guardians I had with me lacked the skill and power when compared to those that follow my siblings. They aren't even in the same league. I was the outcast, and I do have a bit pity for you as such, which is why I tell you these things. Do not mistake my gesture of goodwill for being frightened of death, for at the end of the day, we are all at the mercy of my father.
He continued on while looking grimmer each moment. His cough still persisted, but now much weaker. He knew his time was about to expire, as did those around him.
You are probably about as strong as most of my siblings with the dragon. Not all, but most. I will indeed give you that, Remy said while looking at Dabriana. Have you ever contemplated how you would fare if my father were to return to this realm instead of residing in ours? While I will not beg for my life, and I do not expect mercy, just know what will follow my death will be a test for humanity that you may not survive. The system we have set up now is in large part due to my own insistence. What do you think will happen once one of my father's children dies? Particularly the one who had a large part in the status quo system as it is now?
He asked, looking at each of them deeply as his bleeding began to slow.
I've said all I can say and taught you much, but I don't think it will do you any good, and I predict this fight will be bland and one-sided nevertheless. Who knows? Maybe I'm wrong about you humans. Just maybe you've come to rival the gods themselves.
With the last of his strength, he let off a final odd farewell.
Now, I must say goodbye to humanity. Farewell, Popcorn. Farewell to you all. My time is up, and the curtain has to be drawn. End me now, and may your own shows go on.
They could tell he was about to slip away and had said much more than any of them had expected. Whether it was all truthful or not was one thing, but he did at least seem a bit sincere in his own unique way. Either way, he would be gone in a moment, so there was no use pushing any further. Go ahead, Zimmy, Dabriana told the dragon. With that, the creature lifted the barely living Remy's body in the air and quickly opened his hand. The talons swiftly sliced through the demigod's body, cutting what was left of the mangled mess into 3 distinct chunks of meat. Blood and ichor sprayed everywhere in a fine mist of death. Each of the dragon's heads grabbed one of the falling pieces of meat mid-air and ate them whole. It had an unsettling pleasure upon its face as it chomped upon the semi-divine being. A moment later, it swallowed, and a big gulp could be heard with an echo as each head swallowed simultaneously. They all seemed just a bit overly satisfied with their fill.
If that's all, then I will be resting until the time is right to feast again,
the dragon said. The third head burped out some ashes of Remy's remains. The other 2 glared at it before a beam of light shot from the dragon to Dabriana's necklace. The necklace itself was made of dragonstone, and it wasn't noticeable beforehand as it had been hidden under his cloak and shirt. Afterward, the stone glowed a bright black, white, and red. With both the dragon and the demigod gone, only ashes, embers, and the silence of unanswered questions remained.